You have at various times, including just now, expressed the belief that the United States should look to Denmark and the Scandinavian countries for inspiration of the vision.
Yes.
Where the country is going, as you said, as was alluded to. I was born and grew up in Denmark, and these are countries where the government spends taxes and spends approximately twice the level of the United States. Mm-hmm. And while I am very sympathetic to many of your spending proposals, especially on the things you mentioned on early childhood and single payer and the like, I also know that these are countries that heavily tax everybody, not just the rich people, middle classes. They have consumption taxes on everything of 20%. So while I'm very sympathetic to what you say, my sense is still that you would like to spend as a Scandinavian, but not tax as one.
The bard once wrote that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Perhaps more recently, the Bernie Sanders campaign has argued that private health insurance premiums are essentially a tax paid to a corporation. I think it's important to consider what's really going on and to look at the numbers. All wealth is nature transformed by labor power. That means that before you even get your paycheck, a chunk of what you build or create or ship or provide as a service is taken out in the form of new plant, property, and equipment. It's taken out in the form of dividends checks and yachts. If you want to know how much of what you create ends up in your pocket at the end of the week, you need to consider the capitalism tax you're paying to your boss's boss's boss, too. Here's how that breaks down. The OECD keeps track of this data, called the labor share of output. Let's compare the biggest economies in the global north and our neighbor Canada, most of which have many of these social democratic policies Bernie popularized. The US has a labor share of output of 64%, in the UK 70%, in France 72%, in Germany 68.5%, and in Canada 60%. The OECD also keeps track of what's called the tax burden on labor, or the tax wedge. In the US, it's 31.7%. In the UK, 30.9%. In France, 47.6%. In Germany, 49.7%. And in Canada, 30.9%. What this means is that at the end of the week, out of everything that you create, what you take home in your pocket in the US is 43.7% of what you created. In the UK, 48.4%. In France, 37.7%. In Germany, 34.5%. And in Canada, 41.5%. So the truth seems to be that folks living in the UK, despite their lower college costs and socialized medical system, actually get to keep a larger portion of their work. And Canada isn't much lower than the US either. With Germany and France, though, we're looking at about 6 to 9 points less. That's like 17.5% less by the time you get to cash that paycheck. Where's it going? Some of the major tax expenditures are healthcare, education, and the pension system. So what are those like? In the US, healthcare spending per capita per year is $10,586, which is far and away the highest. In the UK, it's $4,070. In France, $4,965. In Germany, $5,986. And in Canada, $4,974. What's education look like per year? In the US, it's $8,202. In the UK, $7,480. In France, depending on the program, anywhere from $300 to $2,200. In Germany, from $350 to $600, and in Canada, $4,939. Finally, when it comes to the pensions, what percentage of your income is maintained in your pension? In the US, it's 49%. In the UK, it's only 29%. In France, however, it's a whopping 74.5%. In Germany, it's around 50%, and in Canada, 54%. In France, it's clear that the extra taxes are going to highly subsidized education and healthcare and a very generous pension system. It's less clear that in Germany, a large portion is still going to reunification and the development of the former East Germany. The Canadian example shows how we can dramatically lower overall healthcare spending by about half without really altering too much else. The same is true for education and even pensions. If you're tied to keeping about the same level in your pocket while still getting better services, then Canada is a model. The German model, however, shows a robust fiscal stimulus package of taxing and spending to develop the country, and in particular, the former East Germany. The tax burden here is higher. In fact, it's the second highest in the OECD. But there's a reason Germany is the economic powerhouse of the EU, and their healthcare and education systems are obviously more generous. France is more or less social democratic with its high tax, high social safety net model, and trying to touch its pension system tends to lead to riots. So, that's where the taxes go. Where does the rest of the surplus go? For that, we look to one last statistic, the Barron ratio. This is the investment in proportion to the surplus. In the US, the Barron ratio during the golden age of capitalism was around 70%. Now it's 47%. In the UK, it peaked at 80%. Today it's 40%. In France, it peaked at 84%. Today, it's 56%. In Germany, and in particular in West Germany, it peaked at a rather astonishing 139%, which means that Germany was taking on a huge amount of external debt in order to subsidize its economy. Now, it's around 47%. Since the end of the golden age of capitalism, capitalists have gone back to their historical levels of investment, which are quite low. Interestingly, the tax on labor income is higher now than it was in the 1960s, at least in the US, according to the Congressional Budget Office. What that means is that the Reaganomics, Thatcherism, neoliberal era is actually an era of keeping less of your paycheck. The labor share is lower. The tax burden on labor is higher. Corporations pay less tax, and they invest less than they used to. To make up for this shortfall, the amount spent in social services has gone up as a share of GDP, as has consumer debt. This also has to do with an aging population. Looking at the US using Fed data now, as OECD doesn't go back far enough, the labor share of output in 1970 in the US was 64%, and the labor income tax was 22%, meaning that you kept directly half of what you made. Today, the labor share is 60%. The tax is 25%, which means that you keep 45% in your pocket, which is a tenth less than it used to be. This video is meant to be a short one, so I'll leave with this. Neoliberalism marketed itself as being opposed to government dependency, opposed to taxes. It was an era of rugged individualism. But that's not quite what the numbers show. Economic growth is down, corporate power is up, and the real road to serfdom seems to be paved by independent central banks and monetary stimulus. Increasingly, people are working without even receiving wages, being forced into means-tested job training and internship programs that they have to participate in to keep their benefits, which are worth less than minimum wage. Corporations are happy to replace waged workers for these neo-serfs. If only we had known that Reagan had authoritarian sympathies.
Most of the 2,000 German soldiers who are buried there were killed in the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944. But at least 49 headstones are clearly marked SS and contain the remains of Nazi stormtroopers. The SS, originally the security arm of the Nazi Party, pledged allegiance to Hitler first, country second. It was the SS that killed most of the estimated 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust.
The excuse was that there was a military base, an American military base nearby, and the sort of combination of German cemetery and American military base somehow in the minds of Kohl and Reagan made sense. This, as you can imagine, sparked an enormous international controversy about the inappropriateness of an American president really, in a way, celebrating the German SS soldiers. And this is how Reagan responded and defended himself. He says, these SS troops were the villains, as we know. They conducted the persecutions and all. But I think there's nothing wrong with visiting that cemetery where those young men were, because they were victims of Nazism. They were victims just as surely as the victims in the concentration camp. This is a stunning declaration. This is a stunning equation of men, women, and children who died in the gas chambers with SS soldiers who were actually propagating the deaths.
It's only now that I'm editing this that I realize I should have mentioned how monetary stimulus acts as a tax. The Federal Reserve pumps ultra-low interest, hot-off-the-presses money into the coffers of major financial institutions. As Adam Smith reminds us, money grants the power to command the labor of others. Monetary stimulus is a transfer payment in that it redirects purchasing power into the hands of Wall Street elites and puts working people on the hook for it. The era of taxing a commodity money in order to spend up demand is gone. With the fiat money apparatus in place, oligarchs can act like they're letting you keep more of your work while sucker punching you with a convoluted money market scheme. I got so caught up in trying to use liberal logic against liberalism that I basically missed that. Maybe a topic for a future video.